talk about type 1 and type 2 errors as it relates to hypothesis testing. Now, type 1 and type 2 errors, it's very, very easy to get kind of lost in these types of problems and really understanding what a type 1 and type 2 error is. So I'm going to kind of show you and explain in words using this table what a type 1 and type 2 error is. And I'm also going to kind of show you graphically what really is going on here. So I'm going to try and go slow and make this clear. It is a topic you need to be a little bit patient with, and it takes time to really wrap your mind around it. So here we go. With my table, here's what I got. Across the top, this is the population truth. So this is what is actually happening, okay, with our null and alternative hypothesis, all those things. So our options are either the null hypothesis is true, so whatever claim was made is true, or it's false, it's wrong, okay? So either that null hypothesis is true or false. That is the population truth. My decision is basically what did we conclude at the end of these hypothesis tests. Did we reject the null hypothesis or did we fail to reject the null hypothesis? So remember, rejecting the null hypothesis is you basically saying no to the null hypothesis and you have enough evidence for the alternative. If you're failing to reject a null hypothesis, that's where you're like, I don't have enough for the alternative, but I'm okay with the null. So you're failing to reject the null hypothesis means you're okay with the null. Rejecting the null hypothesis means you're saying absolutely not. So we're going to work through each of these squares on did they make a mistake, did they make the correct decision, and what does that look like? So if the null hypothesis is true and you reject the null hypothesis, so you're saying no to something that is true, you made a mistake there. That is a type 1 error. Again, that is happening only if you're rejecting the null hypothesis. It's the only way a type 1 error can happen. You're rejecting the null hypothesis even though it's true. Type 1 error. Let me show you what this looks like graphically. So I have this kind of display here. Let me get a little bit organized. I have this kind of graphical display to kind of hammer this point home. So this is what my distribution is going to look like if the null hypothesis is true. Okay, it's centered at, right here. That's what my distribution looks like. Down here, this would be an alternative hypothesis. So maybe I thought, the claim was my distribution centered here, and I'm trying to argue it's much, much higher. So maybe, this is the null, the alternative claims much higher. A type 1 error, that is where you're going to reject the null hypothesis even though it's true. So think of this little tail right here as alpha, because our type 1 error is the same size as alpha. So maybe you're 0.05. So I'm going out, I'm grabbing my sample, and I'm finding my probability. We hit right in here. So maybe I get a p-value of like 2%, but my alpha is 5%. You're in that rejection zone. Okay, so since we think we're just so far out on our tail, we're rejecting the null hypothesis. What's actually happening here is the null hypothesis was true. It just so happened to be the sample that I got was one of those ultra rare instances where I really am on the very end of my distribution. Okay, so how we do hypothesis testing, if you're one of these extreme values, we're like, that's too extreme. This can't be true. A type 1 error is you're one of those extreme values, but hey, it really is true. The null hypothesis is true. That is a type 1 error, okay? So you believe I'm way out here, so surely this isn't true. Maybe I'm more in this alternative world, but no, you're just one of those extreme values. That is a type 1 error. If you would have rejected the null hypothesis, but the null hypothesis wasn't true, it's false, you just made the correct call. So if you reject a null hypothesis that wasn't true anyways, you made the correct call. So what that looks like is, yeah, you think you're on one of these ends like that can't be true. Maybe I'm centered more in the center of this distribution, which is much more believable, okay? Because remember, you're tending to float around the center of distribution. So instead of being an extreme value, it makes much more sense I'm down here. Type 2 errors, let's get into that. So the null hypothesis is not true, and you fail to reject it. Remember, failing to reject is like, I'm kind of okay with that idea. So if you're okay with the null hypothesis and it's true, again, you made the correct call. You made the correct call. So failing to reject the null hypothesis would mean your sample falls maybe like right here, okay, somewhere in here. If you're falling towards the center of the distribution, yeah, you're going to fail to reject this idea. You're kind of going to believe it. You made the correct call. Here's what a type 2 is. You're going to fail to reject the null hypothesis, but the null hypothesis was not true. This is a type 2 error. A type 2 error. So you're failing to reject the null hypothesis. So HO you're kind of okay with, but HO isn't really what's happening. It's not correct. The alternative is what's actually happening. Here's what this would look like graphically. You're going out, say we're dealing with means, you get an X bar that's going to land you, say, right here. That's where your X bar is landing in the sampling distribution. So of course it makes sense if I'm getting an X bar here, it fits the overall fit of this sampling distribution. So you'd be like, oh, failed to reject the null hypothesis. The truth is you're actually falling on the very tip of the alternative. It makes sense. Yeah, graphically, oh, it looks like I fit here. What's really happening, though, is you're hitting the tip over here. That is a type 2 error. So the alternative hypothesis is really what's happening. You just happen to be hitting one of these extreme values so that it looks like you're still in the null. Okay, that is a type 2 error. I could understand a lot of this is very, very confusing. Type 2 and type 1 errors, they happen kind of on our extremes. A type 1, you think you're on an extreme on your null hypothesis, so therefore this can't be true. You're rolling with the alternative. The reality is you really just were one of those extreme samples. A type 2 error, you think you got a pretty basic sample that aligns with the null hypothesis. The reality is this isn't true. You just so happen to hit on one of those extremes on the alternative hypothesis. That's kind of visually what's happening here with a type 1 and a type 2 error. Some other labels that I have on here, I'll go into detail in a future video. The ability to have a type 1 error is alpha. The ability to have a type 2 error is beta. And we have this thing called power, which I am going to talk about in a little bit further detail in a future video, because we need to understand the existence of type 1 and type 2 errors is out there. So in a future video, I'll look at, well, how can we diminish and decrease the chance a type 1 error happens or decrease the chances of type 2, but that's a future video. So this was just a quick overview of type 1 and type 2 errors. Again, it can be very, very confusing. You got to be patient with it. When I work through the problems, I often find it's easy to draw these tables and think about what exactly is a type 1 error. A type 1 error happens when we reject a null hypothesis that was true. A type 2 error is when we fail to reject a null hypothesis that, well, we really wish we should have rejected that idea. And then graphically kind of helps you out there as well. So again, that was a type 1 and a type 2 error.